My name is Joel Perez, and a little bit more about myself. I am a 20 plus years in higher education. I have worked and served at predominantly white organizations and institutions throughout my career. This includes entry level positions to executive level positions. I'm a first generation college graduate. I'm a son of immigrants. Spanish was my first language. And I am Mexican American, so my parents immigrated from Mexico and met in Los Angeles, and I'm the youngest of three. I am white presenting, so people generally don't assume I'm Latinx until we start talking and getting to know each other, which affords me some privilege of being in spaces that maybe some of my colleagues who are darker skinned or who speak with an accent may not be able to gain access to. So I just want to acknowledge that. I'm cisgender, heterosexual. My preferred pronouns are he, him, and él. So that's a little bit about me. And so again, thank you for allowing me to come in and for you choosing to spend a little bit of your afternoon with me to talk about code switching. What does it mean and how do I overcome it? And really figure out a way to be successful in those spaces where you may or may have to code switch at times, depending on the organization you're working in or the organization you want to work for. So I thought I'd start with a story. As Patricia might have mentioned, I did my undergrad at Biola University, and I remember the day very vividly when my brother drove me to college and dropped me off. My parents weren't able to come with me. And I was one of the few brown faces or people on the campus at the time, predominantly white institution. And what I found myself having to do throughout my first year was really figure out a way how to fit in. And I did that by, at the time, I didn't have the language, but code switching. I had to figure out a way to blend in, speak a different language in the way I talked, the way I interacted. And in some ways, I was really trying to assimilate. And this was really detrimental to me looking back and had some negative impacts on me mentally from an emotional and mental health standpoint. And so this may be you, either in your current situation in your graduate program, depending on who else is in your grad program with you, how you interact with instructors, but also as you think about the job search process and working for organizations that might be predominantly white. So I'm hoping to really be able to talk with you all today about what it means to code switch and the challenges that that may present to you. And at the end, you'll have an opportunity, and as you work through today or hear my presentation, if you have questions, please put those in the chat box and we will get to those or try to get to those throughout or at the end of my presentation. So let's jump into it. Code switching. So you're at work one day and you're talking to your colleagues in that professional, polite, kind of buttoned up voice that people use when they're doing professional work stuff. Your mom or your friend, your partner calls you on the phone and you answer. And without thinking, you start talking to them entirely in a different voice, right? Still distinctly your voice, but a certain kind of your voice, less suited for the office. You drop the G's at the end of your verbs, your previously undetectable accent, your easy Southern drawl, or your sing-song Caribbean lilt, or your Spanish inflected vowels, or your New Yorker is suddenly turned way, way up. You rush your mom or whomever off the phone and in some less formal syntax, yo, I'ma holler at you later. You hang up the phone and you go back to work. Then you look up and you see your co-workers looking at you and wondering who the hell you morphed into for the last few minutes. That right there, that's what I mean when I say code switching. And this quote comes from the podcast Code Switching. If you like podcasts, it's an extremely informative podcast that I would encourage you to download or listen to because it talks a lot about what we're going to be or what I'm going to be talking about today. early on, code switching, or the term, was really meant to describe a change in linguistics, right? When I was growing up, I learned how to speak Spanglish. Even though Spanish is my first language, I would say things that were a mix between English and Spanish, and I still do that, which people sort of look at me funny at times. My wife, who is white, will say you're morphing. That's not the proper way to say that in Spanish. But early on, code switching was used to describe the change in linguistics that people would do around language, to describe language. But code switching, as I described, has morphed into something different, or the term has become to mean something different, particularly for people of color who are working in predominantly white organizations or attending predominantly white institutions. And you can go as far back as really W. Du Bois' work in 1903 in what he wrote in The Souls of Black Folk. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in an amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals, and one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Wow, this is deep, right? This idea of double consciousness, or having to go back and forth. Laura Rendon described this as a borderland effect, not being part of one world or the other world, where you have to switch back and forth in order to be successful, or at least what you determine to how you define success. And this could have some negative consequences on people, and did on me. And so this may describe you, but it may not, right? So I'm not assuming that everyone here has had a negative experience with code switching, or sees it as a detrimental, or having a detrimental impact on you. So I'd like to share with you a video. This is a little bit of a humorous approach to code switching, but some of you may remember this particular video of code switching that President Obama at the time had to do in order to connect with someone. Hopefully it'll come through on your screen. There he is shaking hands, and there he is giving a hug to someone he considers a Black brother, right? So there is a visual of what code switching might mean meant to him at the time, or may mean to you. So I want to be clear. I'm not saying that organizations should be given a pass around code switching. It is detrimental, and organizations need to really think about the culture they create that is maybe asking people to code switch, or people that maybe your supervisor or someone you work with is asking you to do. I had the privilege of being part of a podcast interview around code switching that was taking questions from faculty of color at predominantly white institutions in the Midwest. And the questions were, should I code switch or not code switch? The underlying issue that I would say, and I want to make clear, is that organizations need to change. Our organizations were not designed for people of color in their founding, or the way they were created. And so organizations need to look at themselves. So I am not a proponent of saying you have to code switch in order to be successful. You may agree with me or disagree with me, and that's okay. We can have a conversation about that. But I want to be very clear up front that this presentation is not meant to let organizations off the hook. Okay. So why do people code switch? So what I'd like for you to do is in the chat box, just write down some thoughts. Why do you think organizations, or why do people code switch? So let's take a minute or two for you all to jot some ideas down in the chat box to share some thoughts about why you think people code switch. To stand out. People can't understand what you're saying. Fear. Good. To fit in the environment. Right. To have a deeper connection with the person they are communicating with. Okay. It's easier. True. To show professionalism. Okay. To seem qualified. Yeah. Thank you. Take another minute. Any other thoughts? Socialization, right. In their work or the article entitled "The Cost of Code Switching" that was put out by Harvard Business Review in 2019, identified 3 reasons why people code switch. The first is, and some of you touched on this, is to increase perceptions of professionalism and therefore increase the likelihood of being hired. So I'm guessing those of you who are getting ready to job search or applying for positions, depending on what industry you're going into, you're thinking about, how do I increase the possibility of me being hired? And how is my race and ethnicity, how may that be perceived in the interview process? Or how I write the cover letter, right? Those of you working with Patricia or other career professionals, that may be a point of conversation. Your level of comfort of having to code switch potentially in an interview, and how do you do that effectively? And so I would encourage you, those of you who are, to actually find this article, because it's very helpful in helping you, or could be very helpful in helping you think through what that may look like. And if you're leading an organization, it might also be helpful to help you figure out what your organization can do differently so people don't have this stress of having a code switch in order to be successful. They also said that it helps people of color be seen as better leaders, right? What is a definition of a good leader? Or when people are asked, when you define, if you were to describe the quintessential leader, a lot of times it's white men in particular that people describe. So this, of course, for people of color like myself, or others might impact us in the way we want to define leadership, or what does it mean to be a better leader? I got to look, act, speak a certain way in order to be seen as a better leader. The last thing they talked about is it raises the chance of being hired, right? For some of you, again, you want to increase the likelihood of being hired, and this may mean for some of you figuring out, okay, how do I code switch successfully in order to get that job? Okay. The next thing they talked about is the challenges from code switching. So again, in the chat box, if you want to take a moment to write down, what are some potential challenges that you may experience or people may experience from code switching? So take a minute to jot some of those down. Potential challenges from code switching. Okay, yeah. Not feeling authentic, mental internal conflict, feeling exhausted after changing the way you talk for too long. Good. Yes. A few others. Take another minute. Imposter syndrome. That's right. Thank you, Allison. I'll be talking about imposter syndrome in a little bit. Thank you. Thinking you have to be accepted. Yep, that's a challenge. Yes, for sure. Just a few more seconds. Any other thoughts? Okay. So what they noted as potential challenges are accused of being white, right? And I don't know if some of you have heard this before. I have been accused of being a coconut, which means brown on the outside, white on the inside. And this is actually, I'll give you a personal example, which was hard for me. My brother once accused me of sounding a certain way that was not in tune with my ethnicity. And that was hard for me to hear. But now I realize, as I've been reflecting on the challenges of code switching, right? That you have to sound a certain way or act a certain way, at least, you know, in this case, in our particular country, in our environment, right? This may not be true internationally, but in our current US context, that is the case at times. It can hinder performance because you're so focused on code switching to the point where you don't perform well because you don't feel like you can be who you are. And you may not approach the work you may not be approaching work to your fullest potential because you're always concerned about this idea of code switching or having a code switch. That goes along with reducing the authenticity or self-expression, right? You can't be authentic. And so one of the things I do is I coach. I'm an executive and leadership coach. And I work with clients about being authentic to who they are as leaders, and particularly with their identities that are salient for them. So whether it's ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender, sexual identity, how do you remain true to yourself in the way you lead without feeling like you've sold yourself out, right? Or being a sellout. And that leads to this other thing that they noted as challenge is the idea of leading to burnout, where you just feel mentally and physically exhausted when you go home after work, or when you leave your whatever it is that you're at where you felt like you've had to code switch the entire time. And then the impact that has, and one of you referred to this in the chat, is it impacts your mental and physical health. So I would say generally when I'm coaching a client, when we start talking about code switching, imposter syndrome, racial battle fatigue, and there's this aha moment for some of my clients where they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize the emotional, mental, and physical impact this was having on my health. And then we usually, 9 out of 10 times, will shift to, is this the right organization for you? If you're having to code switch all the time where you're feeling exhausted and you're mentally exhausted and you're not healthy from a mental health perspective, is this the right organization for you? And then it ends up shifting to career coaching, to think about how do you shift or move from this organization to another. And for some of my clients, most of my clients are people of color. Some of my clients who I do career coaching with are actually figuring out, how do I evaluate potential organizations to make sure that my values and who I am, who I am, my identity and all my salient identities, are there an organization where I can feel I can be authentic to myself. And so how do I evaluate the organization in that context? So we talk about values, questions, things you can do on the web to kind of figure out questions you should be asking in the interview process, right? And for a lot of my clients, and this could be the case for you as well, is that you end up, feeling lost, frustrated. You don't want to ask for direction. And this could be in your first 90 days or 30 days when you're in a new organization or a new environment where you're feeling like you always have to code switch. And this creates stress and anxiety. So going back to that mental and physical health aspect, this can be a challenge and maybe a challenge for you. So this is how it feels at times. And I've been there. I've worked with clients and I've experienced that myself. And then, of course, this leads to feelings of isolation where you feel like you're the only one. Where you feel like you are isolating yourself, you feelings of being the only one. And this starts to make you feel marginalized at times. So I'm not saying this is true for all of you, or maybe true for all of you, but it could be for some of you where you start to feel marginalized and really lost, going back to that other slide where you're feeling like alone, where you're feeling alone. And your identities are intertwined just as all the challenges are intertwined together. And so you feel like this yellow house in the midst of all these other houses that are in black and white. Right? So this leads to what some folks have called stereotype threat, and which is around this self-confirming concern that one will be evaluated based on a negative stereotype. So you start believing this in the way you work, the way you interact with people, where it becomes a threat. And if you haven't read the book, Whistling Vivaldi, the authors talk about this idea of stereotype threat and the challenges that brings, where you feel like you're not, you're not the only, you are starting to take on these stereotypes and feeling like you don't belong. And it impacts the way you work, the way you interact with others. And for some, the reaction is to code switch, to try to fit in, to try to, in order for you to be successful, you may code switch. And I'm going to talk a little bit, because I think it was important for me to touch upon this idea of microaggressions, which some of you, if not all of you, are familiar with, right? Or this, as Sue talks about, Dr. Sue in 2010, defined it as this everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicates a hostile, derogatory, or negative message to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership. And I would say that some organizations, people experience a lot of this. And again, I don't want to let organizations off the hook, because organizations need to evaluate themselves on what type of environment they're creating in their organization that allows microaggressions to happen. And this next slide is really the quote I'm going to read you here is from Dr. Ibram Kendi in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, where he talks about, I don't use microaggressions anymore. He detests the post-racial platform that supported its sudden popularity. He detests its component parts, micro and aggression. He says it's a persistent daily low hum of racist abuse, and it's not minor. He uses the term, or wants to focus on the term, abuse, because aggression is not as exacting a term. Abuse accurately describes the action and itself on people: distress, anger, worry, depression, anxiety, pain, fatigue, and in some extreme cases, suicide. What other people call microaggression, he calls racist abuse. And it's that thing, or this metaphor that's being used around paper cuts, right? All these microaggressions or small paper cuts lead to deep cuts that require our attention if we're experiencing them or have experienced them for a long period of time. And so when I work with clients, we talk about microaggressions and some of the challenges those bring, and maybe how to develop a strategy to address them in your organization or with others. I want to talk about imposter syndrome. Clance and Imes back in 1978 defined what they call imposter phenomenon as an individual experience of self-perceived intellectual phoniness. Similar in some ways to stereotype threat, it leads to questioning whether one belongs, including in a particular leadership role, right? These thoughts are, I must not fail. I feel like a fake. It's all down to luck. Success is no big deal. So minimizing your own success because you just don't feel like you may belong. And I felt this image sort of highlights that, right? The smart car doesn't belong in the midst of these mail vans, right? And so you may not feel like you belong at times. Amy Cuddy, if you haven't listened to Amy Cuddy, any of Amy Cuddy's work or TED Talks, I would encourage you to do that. But she talks about, I don't just study imposterism, I experienced it. And it didn't just I didn't just experience it, I inhabited it. It was like a little house I lived in. Of course, no one else knew I was there. It was my secret. It nearly always is. That's how imposterism gets such a good grip. It pays you hush money. If you don't tell anyone about those feelings, then people are likely to think, maybe she really doesn't deserve to be here. No need to give them any ideas, right? Again, some thoughts that we have around imposter syndrome. I was working, I had a grad student or a student that I used to mentor undergrad who went to grad school, got his master's, working in his first job. He's Latinx. And he and I were talking on the phone, and he's like, Dr. Perez, I don't feel like I belong. I'm doing this I'm having imposter syndrome. And I said, yeah, that's pretty common. He's like, it is. I thought I was over it. And I said, no, it'll always rear its ugly head at times. And the key then is, how do you mitigate its impact in your work life as you're working in whatever job or organization you're working in? The hope is that you can figure out ways to mitigate its impact, because it's always going to be there. It doesn't go away. So I work with clients on developing ways to mitigate its impact, or ways to remind yourself that you do belong. And for some, imposter syndrome has more of an impact than others. But it could also lead to this idea, again, going back to code switching, where you feel like you have to fit in order to overcome that imposter syndrome. And all this leads to racial battle fatigue. And one of you referenced it in the chat, or this idea, as critical race theorist William Smith defined it, as a cumulative result of a natural race-related stress, responses to distressing mental and emotional conditions. These conditions emerge from constantly facing racially dismissive, demeaning, intensive, and/or hostile racial environments and individuals. Wow, racial battle fatigue. That's hard, right? As I read this again, as I reflect on this, I remember the impact that racial battle fatigue has had on me, and for me to look for spaces where I can be myself, whether it's with my family or with colleagues who look like me, who experience the world like I do. Those are the people that I would go to find encouragement. And this may or may not be you. I'm not saying it is. And we could talk about it. If you have questions around racial battle fatigue, we can explore those. But imposter syndrome, stereotype threat, code switching, they all can lead and may lead to racial battle fatigue. And it can be detrimental to you and your success as a professional in the work, whatever work that you choose to do. So I want to spend a little bit of time now on strategies before opening it up to questions. So what are the strategies to overcome some of these things, Dr. Perez, people have asked me, or the clients I work with? And so I'm going to give you a little bit of a flavor of some things that you can do as you think about code switching, racial battle fatigue, imposter syndrome, stereotype threat. The idea or the hope is that you can build resilience, right? The resiliency, and what does that look like? And so this is taken from Block et al.'s work in their article, Contending with Stereotype Threat at Work, a Model of Long-Term Responses. So you yourself challenging the negative group stereotypes that you may be encountering, positively distinguishing yourself for that positive distinctiveness, that you do belong, that you are part of this idea of collective action. So what I talked about early is seeking out affinity groups. And some organizations that you may be looking to work at provide affinity groups. So that's a question you may want to ask. Are there affinity groups in this organization for Asian Americans, for African Americans, for Latinx professionals? Or do I have to look for those outside of this organization? And this idea of positive distinctiveness, I want to go back to that, is an individual works, or you could work to generate positive social value for your identity group by making your group distinct and stressing the importance of that distinction, right? So having those conversations with your colleagues, with your supervisor, with your leadership team. This idea of redefining criteria for success. So establishing what success means on your own terms, really spending time on what is it, how you define success for yourself, and not based on how other people define success. And so as long as we keep dusting off, as long as we don't let the dust stay on us, then we realize that there is something quiet about being a Black woman. And this is a quote taken from that article, right? So finding the positive things that your group particularly has done in the work that you are pursuing and or are in. In addition, the idea of responding to microaggressions, that's tough, right? Sometimes you are not sure if you want to respond to a microaggression. And so some questions to ask yourself, did the microaggression really occur? Sometimes it's flagrant, right? And so it. Like for me, one time when I was an undergrad, I was working at the computer store on our campus, and I had shared with my manager that I was Latinx, or at the time I used the term Hispanic, and he's like, "Really? I didn't know you were Hispanic. You don't speak with an accent." Wow, I couldn't just believe he just said that. So at that point, it was there. Now, at the time, back in the 90s, there was some early work being done on microaggressions, but I didn't have a way to label what had just happened, right? And so, asking your colleagues or people in the room about whether that just happened, and if it did, okay, are you going to address it? Should you respond to that microaggression? And that's a question you're going to need to answer. And there are some risks of responding and not responding. And so I do work around this framework of crucial conversations, when you have to have hard conversations with people. And I work with clients on how to have those conversations. So the first thing I ask is, do you feel safe to have that conversation because of the power dynamics, whether it's physical safety or even just professional safety? Asking yourself, will that lead to an argument? What's the impact on the relationship with this person who just stated that? If I don't respond, will I regret it? And that's a question, again, you're going to have to answer for yourself. You may choose not to answer. You may choose not to address it, but is that going to have, are you going to be able are you going to be okay with that, or will you regret it? And if you're going to regret it, then let's talk about ways that you can address the microaggression. And then how should you respond, right? And I think this is where it's important. Those of you, I'm guessing you all have mentors in your programs, and or either in your programs or outside your programs, seeking the support of a mentor, family, colleagues, or a coach in addressing the microaggression is going to be really important. Talk about imposter syndrome. So again, some things that you need to do is recognize imposter syndrome when they emerge, rewrite your mental program. So again, acknowledging that you do belong, physically writing things down, or mentally shifting your paradigm around this idea that you do belong in this organization, you do belong in the room. Talk about your feelings. Consider your context, right? What's happening around you? Why am I feeling this? Why am I experiencing this? Reframe your failure as a learning opportunity. So even though you might make a mistake, like everyone does in a job, we're not perfect. You may miss a due date. You may not respond to a situation in a timely way. This, again, reframing the failure as a learning opportunity, not as something that you should internalize. Be kind to yourself. Seek support. Visualize your success. This, again, these are strategies on how you may be able to overcome imposter syndrome. Continue to go on, developing self-confidence, self-care, counseling, therapy. And for some of you, you may need to seek out a therapist to help you process the code switching that you're experiencing, or the impact that code switching is having on you. Colleagues, family, familia, the practice of mindfulness. If you haven't done work around mindfulness, I would encourage you to maybe seek out some resources around mindfulness to help you think through or pause before you react or respond to something. Learning how to have crucial conversations, and then reflecting and journaling is really important, I believe, and would stress the importance of being reflective and journaling on your experiences. So that way you're able to note when it's happening again, and how are you physically feeling. This is where mindfulness is really important, is to be totally in tune with your body. So if you feel like you're code switching and your body is reacting a certain way, you can then remember, like, wait a minute, I got to pause here. I was working with a client the other day, and I said, well, where was that physically manifesting itself? And she said, I was starting to clench my fists. And I said, okay, so next time you feel like you're about to clench your fists, that's when you need to pause and think about what you're about to say or how you're going to respond, so that way it doesn't happen. And so these are some strategies that you can apply. So all going back to this idea of feeling isolated, right? You don't want to feel isolated. You want to feel, or you want to feel like you do belong, and not just feel that way, but actually internalize that, so you are able to be fully successful in the environment that you're in. And so that's what I do. I want to end with this quote before we open it up to questions, but it's from Muhammad Ali. And I want you to repeat this repeat this to yourself. I am the greatest. I said that even before I knew it was. You do belong. You don't need a code switch to be successful. You can minimize the impact. And so these are some things for you to consider as you think about code switching, stereotype threat, microaggressions. And so I'm going to open it up for questions. Again, my organization is Apoyo Coaching. You can look me up online. I'll leave, this is my contact information. If you want to connect, I'm on LinkedIn. I would encourage you to do that. You can visit my website. You can email me directly. And so I'll leave that up for a while. And then I will go ahead and, Patricia, if you want to see if there's any questions in the chat box, that would be great.
Sure, thank you. So anyone that has questions, please feel free to post those in the chat box. And even if you just have a thought that you'd like to share with Joel, that would be great as well. All right, Joel, so we do have a first question come in. Does code switching mostly describe conversations between people, or can it apply to presentations or other scenarios?
Yeah, I think it can apply to presentations. I think, there are times where you're going to have to give a presentation right in front of people, and you may have to code switch in order for you to do that. And so the idea or the thought is that something you're going to need to do, and are you okay with that? But it does apply to, it's not just between people. It can be when you're giving a presentation, when you are in a boardroom. Those are some things that are definitely going to pop up. And so again, I do some work with organizations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so some of the things I talk about is what's happening in meetings, right? And so is your culture requiring people of color or from other historically marginalized groups to code switch? And is that really the kind of environment you want to create? And so, yeah, so that definitely, it does apply to in other contexts.
And I would add too, a few of the students that are here today are looking at faculty roles down the road. So certainly as a faculty in front of a classroom, would you agree?
Yeah, I would. And then I'm sure some of those of you who are thinking about faculty roles, institutions are really grappling with, course reviews tend to be more negative, particularly for women and women of color than their male counterparts. And so that's something, again, the institution needs to think about, and you need to think about to point that out when you're going through review time, is to keep that in mind, so you don't internalize that. And then also for the institution to think about, okay, how do we factor that in? So if someone got a negative review, course review, it may be because of the students having these stereotypes, and or just more critical of people of color and or women and women of color.
Great, thank you. Could you talk a little bit about the difference between code switching and code mixing?
Yeah, I don't know if if there's a difference. I think I would say, I haven't done a lot of work with code mixing. I'm guessing there's a lot of overlap in that process, or if you're experiencing that. And so I don't have a lot to say to that, unfortunately, but my guess is there's a lot of overlap and not a very stark difference.
Right.
Let me ask a question. Oh, here we go. Do you ever think code switching is a good skill? That is a good question. It is a skill. It's a good skill. I would go back to, I'm not saying you're never going to need a code switch. When I work with clients, I really like to focus on, one, are you okay with code switching? And if you're having to do it a lot, is it having a negative impact on you physically and mentally? And if it is that the healthiest place to be? I think we all have had to code switch at times. And I think I would say, and people may not agree with me, or some of you may not agree with me, I think you need, if you have to do it, there's a healthy level of code switching that you may need to do given the environment you're in. But if it starts to have this really negative impact on your life, like the racial battle fatigue stuff I talked about, that's where it becomes a problem. And so, I think that's something to evaluate. And each of you need to do that. Yeah.
There was another question that came in. Do kids or children realize that they learn to code switch, and at what age, if so?
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of research on children and code switching, so I don't know. I think kids probably with us as parents, those of us who are parents, probably maybe they don't have the language of calling it code switching, but have probably had to change their approach depending on which parent they're talking about, or with their school environment. But I haven't seen any research on pinpointing at what age that tends to happen. So the question I had for those of you that are still with us is, and you don't need to give me any details, but have you ever felt like, just say yes or no, have you ever felt like you had to code switch in your current context? So just give me a yay or nay. Okay. Are there any strategies, and how many folks are on the call? No, 10. Are there any strategies that you have implemented that have helped you manage the code switching, or yeah? Any thoughts on that? Anyone want to type anything to the chat? Strategies or ways you've approached code switching. Excuse me, my cat is meowing at me. She wants to be let out, but we're good. Yeah, thanks, Patricia. Yeah, having a safe person is really important. So whether, again, going back as a family member, a mentor, a colleague, who you can feel safe with to decompress is really important, as a way to work through code switching. Yeah, that's good around, particularly around language, right? And understanding your context and asking a clarifying question around, can people understand what you're saying? Um, my hope is that if it's at an organization that you've spent time with, that you don't have to do that every time. That they understand who you are and what you're bringing, and that they've learned um, to sit in a meeting with you and not have to ask that question. Again, that goes back to the organizational processing that an organization may need to do, particularly if they want to work at creating a more inclusive environment. Any other questions for me? Anything else? Any burning questions?
I guess I would just ask if you had sort of the final big picture overall summary you'd like to leave us with.
Yeah, I think I want to just go back to unfortunately, code switching is sort of a part of our environment, our culture. I think it goes back to, particularly those of you that are job searching, even faculty roles, is really think about how to evaluate the organization that you are interviewing with. And if if there are any red flags in that process that you could pick up on before you're offered and take a position, that then could lead to having really negative impact on you. So going back to like asking about affinity groups, do those exist? How supportive are people of your own professional development? And so those are some questions that you can ask, and you could probably pick up on some things as you're interviewing, the way people are interacting with you, to make sure that you feel safe and that you can show up fully as who you are and the salient identities you have.